Hey, smart authors, welcome back to another episode of the Smart Author Podcast. Today I'm joined by Dan Nicholson, and Dan has written a pretty awesome book called Rigging the Game. Dan's book is an awesome one for being able to systematically jig how you can control the outcomes of anything that you're trying to solve. But more importantly, Dan actually did a really, really fantastic strategy for launching his book. And in today's episode, we talk a little bit more about how he launched his book, the success he had there, and then, a little bit more about his background and how he came up with the idea for his book as well. So if you really want a masterclass in how to launch your book, then I highly recommend you check out this episode and what Dan has to say at the end of the episode or towards the end of the episode. It's going to be a incredibly awesome resource for you so that you get some ideas for what you can do to have some pretty awesome success when you're launching your first or your next book. Hope you enjoy. Let's roll the intro. Welcome back, smart authors, to another episode of the Smart Author Podcast. Today I'm joined by Dan Nicholson. Dan has a pretty amazing book called Rigging the Game that we wanted to talk to you about today. And Dan, you're a best-selling author and someone who's done some pretty amazing things in the space. I'd love if you could give everyone a bit of a rundown of who you are, what you do, and the accomplishments you've achieved.
I have always sort of been an entrepreneur at heart. I was very much that kid growing up scheming on business ideas, mostly terrible business ideas, but always just kind of aspiring to go against the grain, if you will. And there's a little bit of almost a contradiction of sorts too, because I was also painfully shy and had speech problem, really bad teeth. It's just, and so I don't know if that, at some level, just fed my desires to kind of maybe prove things to myself. And so with that in mind, I went off to college. I'm the first person in my family to go to college and got degrees in information systems and accounting, thinking, okay, that's going to be the best skill set: accounting, language of business, information systems, or technology. Put those together, best skill set to be an entrepreneur. And then some would argue I went the furthest possible direction from entrepreneurship as you could possibly go, which is I did a fellowship at the board that writes all the US accounting standards. So that's sort of the closest equivalent that people can sort of earmark it to is clerking for the Supreme Court at a law school. Be kind of the closest kind of parallel to that. And that put my career on this kind of weird trajectory of sorts, because I worked on this really, really technical accounting standard derivatives and hedging. Mm-hmm. So I will not bore the audience with those details. But then I sort of became a so-called derivatives and hedging expert and worked for a global accounting firm with clients that typically had $100 billion or more in investable assets, and was miserable doing it. So I moved around for a while between jobs, 3 or 4 different jobs. People kept hiring me because they're like, hey, you must be smart. You did this cool fellowship. But I always had this inner monologue of, you probably shouldn't hire me because I'm probably going to I'm going to be your best employee for the first 3 months because I'll be super curious about what's going on. And then I'm going to be a terrible employee because I'll know what the shortcuts are and I'll get kind of wanderlust, and really I should be self-employed.
Yeah.
So I did that for a while. Warren Buffett backed company. I worked for this guy, Steve Loudon, who was the CFO who took Roku public, mm-hmm. and I think he's their CFO. So did a bunch of stuff that looks cool on a resume, but like I said, I was truthfully kind of lost in trying to figure out what I should be doing, and maybe some unnecessary guilt of sorts about, like I said, first person in my family to go to college. I'm making more than my dad, who's working 70, 80 hours a week in a really blue collar job, and who am I to be ungrateful for the wonderful opportunities that he and my mom allowed me to have. And so I was they never put that on. I was conflicted of sorts. And finally, about 13 years ago or so, I realized that there was opportunity to do something different in the accounting space. And so that was sort of the first foray into giving myself permission to be a full-time entrepreneur. And ultimately, that's what led me to eventually write the book, which is kind of it's not a memoir, but it's almost like here's everything I had to unlearn that I thought I knew in a book about how to engineer the outcomes that you want.
Right. So was it hard for you to actually go to college knowing that you're an entrepreneur? Like, was it hard to sit and learn and just be in education for several years?
I would say, well, I didn't really uh, give myself much time to even think about that. I was working almost a full-time job simultaneously to go into college.
Yeah.
And I have a really unhealthy relationship with competition. So I had this I was overly focused on good grades. And so very much like, what's the most I can do? I did 5 years worth of college in 4 years, working full time. And I was graduated number one in my class. And all this sounds like humble bragging or anything, but more just like my personality very much then as a 18 to 22-year-old was trying to prove what I was capable of doing. It wasn't necessarily about everyone else, but it was like proving what I could do. And sometimes it's a bit much. Or was back then for sure. Because I wish I would have enjoyed it. I wish I would have had more fun.
Yeah, for sure. So what led you to like thinking of your book and actually starting the process there?
Yeah, so the details I've kind of shared with you so far is up till becoming self-employed, I was accustomed to the 4.0 and getting these jobs that I never even imagined I could have. And so I was used to finding the quote unquote right answers, if you will. And then when I finally became self-employed, I realized I don't know anything. I really don't. Like these things that I thought I understood about business and I learned at business school just don't work. And I got really fascinated with why is it that some people do all the research? Like that's kind of my personality or was. Why do some people do all the research and win? And then other people do no research and just bet on themselves and they win. And then they try it again on a second business and it doesn't work. What is it? What are the actual nuances that create success? And what I had learned at college and everything at that point just wasn't working. And so I kept kind of reflecting on kind of the disconnects. And finally, I heard this concept from a friend, Alan Anderson's his name. He still a lot of work with like Jocko Willink. And he was telling me about in goal setting, first you optimize, then you maximize. And he was sharing this principle. And it got me thinking like maximize. No, in Fortune 500 companies, everything you do is maximize. Maximize, just have the most clients, etc. But the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, you have to maximize shareholder value. Like that is your job. And I realized that everything I learned in business school is about maximizing. But when you're a small business owner, you don't have those resources, so you have to optimize. And as simply as that sort of like small word changes, I realized, well, everything I've been doing are tools serve to maximize, but I need to be optimizing. And I don't really even think I know how to do that. And that was like a lead domino to really starting to question all the decision tools that I had and frameworks and kind of pulling all those different strings.
Yeah, gotcha. So what does it take to change the switch from maximizing to optimizing?
Yeah, well, my belief, it's a great question. So I think first is kind of an understanding of the human condition, dopamine. We are just wired to want to maximize. We are wired to chase more. And it makes sense. Dr. Andrew Huberman, Huberman Lab podcast, he talks about how dopamine is the molecule of more. And so we are wired towards that. And more isn't always more takes us constantly back to maximizing. And you start to pull on that string a little bit and you realize that we are just all biased. Now, a lot of social media and other things are throwing stones at each other. Like, I'm not biased, but you're biased. And so there's a kind of a frame shift that you have to make to realize that more isn't always the answer. This is actually one of my fundamental commandments I write about in the book, which is we should bias closer over more. In other words, not always do we need more clients, more revenue, etc. In fact, what we need to do is think, are these decisions going to get me closer to what I really want? That's really what the essence of optimizing is. What is the main thing I can do, the highest leverage action I can take that gets me closer to the thing that I want?
Yeah, right. So I guess like otherwise the things that we say that we want most likely arbitrary and it's not like a core root want.
Yeah, I think that there's two types of, I have this overarching framework I call financial certainty. I think what everyone is ultimately seeking is certainty. But certainty is what I want and what you want are not the same.
Yeah.
But I think we can break that into two pieces. One is what I would call core priorities, which is kind of the traditional definition of financial security. I want to be able to pay off my debts, have enough where I don't have to work, and maybe a little bit of extra sort of cash reserves. Everyone seems to kind of unify around wanting those three things. But then, so those are core priorities. Then we're left with this whole other bucket of preferences. And preferences are just unique to you. And there's no right or wrong. And in fact, they're a want. They're not a need. And so you're allowed to want them. The problem is that many of us have not given ourselves permission to just want something because we want it. We feel the need that we have to justify and rationalize it to the world, but you can't really because it's just a want. I just want it because I want it. And
my biggest thing, sorry to cut you off, Dan, is that like I don't have to justify it to the world. I have to justify it to my wife.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I used to get into these arguments I've been married for 15 years, and we would get into these arguments early in our marriage until we actually realized we're just arguing over preferences. So both of us are right. And I have this analogy about loading the dishwasher. There's usually one person in the house who has a very strong feeling about how the dishwasher should be loaded. Is that the case in your house?
Yeah, my wife does, for sure.
Your wife? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so what happens is that you move in together, and then there's like these micro conversations that happen. They're like, hey, would you mind putting the forks in this way and put the glasses this way? And there's all these sort of like one-off things. And then you irritate the person who cares about the dishwasher because they go in, they open like, hey, I thought we agreed to put the forks in this way. Or I thought well, I don't really agree. Like, I didn't think it was that big of a deal. Did this happen between you and your wife?
Yeah. I kind of conformed, genuinely.
Yeah. And so I call it moving from agreeing to aligning. So on preferences, you're never going to agree. That's such a high standard to get someone to, because agree is like, yeah, that's the way I would do it. Mm-hmm. But if you can shift to align, which is, hey, you know what? That's your preference. It's not how I would do it. I don't agree with you, but I can align, meaning I'll take it on and do it as if it was my own. And that is like such a lower cognitive threshold to go like, yeah, cool. I can align on these things. That's your preference.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to argue with you about it, even though I think it's ridiculous.
I'd love to hear if anyone has the same conflicts in their household about loading the dishwasher.
I have done this in rooms with 50 people and 300 people. I've asked like, who in here has had like a conflict over how to load a dishwasher? It's like 80% of the room. And they're either that person, so they feel like attacked, or they're like laughing because they're like, oh yeah, that's definitely my roommate, or that's definitely my spouse. They're that person.
Oh, that's funny. So like the thing for me here that's pretty funny is that like the dishwasher preferences is such a big thing, but then, you know, what's left in the sink is like, that's like where I get anal about things. I'm like, just like, can we just leave the sink clear? And then it's just like, well, really, you know, if you really cared about the way that the dishwasher was loaded, you know, the sink should be clear all the time as well. So it's funny that like, you know, it's kind of like, you know, a bit of inconsistency, I would say, in the conversation.
100%. And to me, that goes back to biases. And it's just a good example of how logic there's a bias actually called the mental accounting bias. And it, based off how we label things, significantly changes the way we. And there's a case study, scientific test around going to a movie theater. And if you, and the example involves someone buying a ticket beforehand for $10 versus, and they lose the ticket, versus having $10 and they lose the $10. Both things are worth the same, $10. The movie ticket costs $10, they had a $10 bill. But depending on if they were to lose the ticket versus the money, they behave significantly different in terms of whether or not they're going to repurchase, whether they're going to actually see the movie. Sorry to explain that. Fumble over my words. In both cases, they lost something of $10 of value, but it has a more than 30% difference in how people behave with the next decision.
Okay. And what's that difference?
So, whether or not they actually see the movie.
Yeah.
So if they lost, I don't remember exactly how it played out, but I think that it goes, if they lost $10, they're significantly less likely to go to the movie than if they lost their ticket.
Gotcha. So they're kind of happy to rebuy a ticket if they lose the ticket.
I think I might have a flip flop, but it's one of the two where it's a significant difference, which is why if we label something savings versus checkings, we behave differently, or if we call something our retirement funds. So you could see somebody who's buried in debt, but they won't take money out of their savings account because they earmarked it for retirement. Oh, that's my retirement fund. So they're buried in debt, and the math shows that it would be better for them to just pay off the debt and they'd be in a better place. But because they've labeled it a certain way, it changes the way they behave.
Right. And
so for this sort of like a dishwasher versus the kitchen sink, or versus, it's like you can look very much like a hypocrite depending on how you are in your mind labeling it, and then therefore assigning value to the behavior itself.
Yeah, gotcha. Interesting. Well, Dan, I would love to switch gears here and talk a little bit more about the process that you went through with your book in terms of launching it. So like all the pre-selling process, the launching process, and the way that you were able to kind of create a bit of a word of mouth thing with getting quote unquote an army of people to kind of promote the book.
Yeah, so going back to, so the book came out near the end of last year, 2022, but the process started a couple years prior. And I write about some of these principles and stuff in the book itself. Cool. But the concern is always, I'm going to spend a bunch of time on something and no one's going to buy the book. It's a case of a book. And that there's a trade-off. There's something I could have been doing with that time that would have got me to my goal faster. So I like to set rules and cut parameters in advance and take what I call a micro step. What's the smallest action I can take to validate whether or not this thing is working? So in advance, I said, if I can sell 100 copies off of a Facebook post, then that's enough for me to validate taking the next step.
Yeah.
And then I did. So I posted about it. I got commitments for more than 100 sort of copies, and that's what validated, let me take the next step. Ultimately, I used a platform called Publishizer. To do a full scale kind of pre-order campaign over a few week period of time. And we pre-sold, last I checked, we're still the platform record for pre-sales. So several thousand copies.
Nice.
And so pre-sold 100, that was enough to like put in more effort, ultimately do the Publishizer, and sold enough copies where I had reasonable certainty that if I were to write it, it would be a bestseller. I'd make at least the USA Today bestseller list.
Cool.
And so then so obviously I finished it and had enough. I had to learn a lot of lessons about how to actually get those sales to count towards the bestseller list, which I'm sure you're aware of, those intricacies of what sales count. And so that was kind of like a fire goes to the face to learn all of that stuff. But pre-sold enough to get enough momentum to get the bestseller. And with that, the people who pre-ordered, they were invested in helping me run kind of a launch squad and so they got advanced copies electronic format so they could read it, leave reviews when it launched. And essentially my premise was what's in it for them. So my publisher said, hey, if you want to hit number one in a few categories on Amazon, you're going to need at least 150 people in a launch squad.
Yeah.
Because about a third will actually take all the actions necessary, leave a review, etc. And so I thought, well, this is a really one-sided transaction because I've asked them to buy something, then I've asked them to read it, and then I've asked them to review it. And that's all me just making asks of them. So really it was just what's in it for them? And how am I giving them significantly more value than the ask that I'm making?
Yeah.
And so set up a series of feedback loops and benefits and a launch, virtual launch party where I had some friends come on and kept stacking these benefits for them based on each action they took. So like, okay, you left a review. If you can share your review on social media and then give me the link to that so I can reshare it for you so you get more exposure, I'm going to give you this course, or I'm going to give you this access to this launch party. So we just kept kind of stacking these benefits where they were getting dopamine and incentive feedback, and the value was more than their time. And so I ended up having closer to 80% of the people who signed up actually taking action on it. So I was told, hey, you could expect a third.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it was more like 80%. And I think it was because they were getting more value and it didn't feel one-sided like a favor. Favors like I'll get to what I get to because I'm doing you a favor.
Yeah.
But in this case, I'm trying to reward you. I'm trying to make sure that I'm compensating you more than your effort.
Yeah.
So that sort of stacked up over time, and now we I consistently 9 months later, I sell more now than I was after the first couple of weeks of the launch party.
Do you think that's because of just the reputation that you've now built in the space? Like it's kind of just a compounding effect of people getting a book and telling other people about your book and so on?
I think that's a big part. The nefarious thing that happens as an entrepreneur is you put in so much effort to launch something and then you get that reward and then you move on to the next thing. And the reality is the real benefits like 9 months from now or a year or 2 years from now. And so I think a lot of people, they put out their book and they put in a really massive push for a few weeks and then they kind of just ignore it.
Yeah.
And I thought about it more as I probably really won't see benefit for 9 to 12 months or more.
Yeah.
And, so keeping it top of mind is probably like, to me, the biggest thing. You put so much work into it, try to keep the momentum going.
And do you run any advertising for your book, or is it all organic, word of mouth kind of stuff?
I have started in the last couple months.
Okay, cool. And
just some.
Yes. Nice. Yeah. I mean, for me, it's like definitely the conversation I have with my clients and peers is that, it's a long game thing. Like a book, it can be a direct conversion element. It can be something that you see something come of right away, but it's also a longer form thing. And I'm assuming like you've got some level of back end in your business that the book can relate to as well. And so, when we look at the book and the way that we market the book and the way that people get the book, it's like, yeah, we're going to see people get the book and love everything that you do, and want to become a client of yours because they love the messaging and the things like that. But, someone might buy your book today and not read it for 3 months, 6 months, potentially. And so you'll see a massive knock-on effect in years to come, or even, someone might read it and go like, oh, I'd love to work with Dan, and then kind of follow up in a few months as well. And so I think that I love the way that you're thinking long-term with how you approach a book.
Yeah, I think you made a lot of great points there. I know how many books that I've purchased that are just like sitting on my nightstand. That it's like 6 months or a years before I finally pick it up. So there is a really long tail. Also, because I'm kind of a data nerd, I got this plugin because I was curious how much other books were selling in terms of volume. And you probably know all these numbers. I'm just telling you stuff that you already know. But I was looking at the difference between, say, my book is on Amazon somewhere in the 20 to 25,000 range in terms of rank.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, what's the difference between that and like Pat David's book, who's consistently in like the 2000 range, or Alex Ramose's book? And I was surprised to see that the difference was not that significant. It's like 300 to 500 copies a month difference.
Really?
To move from in the 20,000 range to the 2,000 range.
Interesting.
And that's, if you're strategic about it. Of course, my books aren't reading the game. Like, I'm kind of obsessed with, to an extent, about like how do you engineer the outcomes that you want. And so I had been playing around with some ways that I could engineer those additional 200 or 300 copies a month.
Yeah.
Because as you know, once you get into that top 2,000 to 5,000 range consistently, I believe it's easier to stay there, because then you're showing up on the other top books frequently purchased section, and that starts to compound.
What are your thoughts on rigging the game for this then?
How to go about doing that specifically?
Yeah.
Well, just as an example, take Alex Ramose's book. He sells $100 million offers for right now $1.90.
Mm-hmm.
And my book, e-copy, is also $1.90. So if I, for example, wanted all my clients to have a copy of my book and his book, I might want to figure out a way that over the course of a couple months and strategically have copies of his book and my book purchased simultaneously through Amazon, so that we're going to be
related,
commingled as a frequently purchased together.
Yep.
And engineer me moving into that top 2,000 to 3,000 range.
Yep. And have you been watching the launch of his $100 million leads book?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. It's always interesting. I think he's probably one of the best people as well, especially with the way that he's grown his YouTube and stuff, in terms of kind of, I think it's been a sense of leading up to how he is going to launch these books.
What I find actually really interesting too is you look at the book he wrote before $100 million offers, and I think it's called Gym Launch Secrets,
yeah,
something like that. And that wasn't exactly like a massive, bestseller. If you look at, as far as I can tell, looking at the number of ratings and transaction volume and etc., my book was roughly in the same spot that his book was, sort of at the same time after launch. And so I just mentioned that because I think it's easy to sort of to measure yourself against someone all the people who are crushing it,
mm-hmm.
and miss the fact that $100 million offers was his second book. It wasn't his first book. One of my favorite authors, fiction author. Have you read the book Tomorrow?
I haven't.
By author Gabrielle Zevin, I believe is how she pronounces her last name. It's a fiction book. She's got, just perspective, like 55,000 reviews on her book. It came out last year, New York Times bestseller. Yeah, it came out July 5th, 2022. 55,000 right now. Consistently, there's a New York Times list. And you start looking back. She had another book called The Story Life of A.J. Thickery that was also successful. But she's got like 6 other books before that have like a couple hundred reviews.
Right. Oh, wow.
And it's just a good reminder of, you focus on the folks who, like, how do I get to where Alex Ramose is? Or how do I get to Gabrielle Zevin? Like, well, you don't give up after one book because it doesn't get 50,000 reviews. Like, she's on her like 8th or 9th book. He's on his coming up 3rd book.
Mm.
And so I guess it's sort of a reminder that for many of us, it took us like 15 years for the rest of the world to see us as an overnight success.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I know Alex's background and have been in the similar circles to him for many years now. And so like I've kind of seen the whole trajectory of him, with YouTube and after $100 million. I think honestly, that book was like the Kickstarter for him to kind of get traction and visibility. So it's just, yeah, it's definitely interesting because you're right. And, people change the way that they operate as well. Like Gym Launch Secrets, his first book was very much a vehicle for the other business that he used to run, the gym launch business. And so, with that in mind, it was like obviously a really good lead generation book for his business at the time, but he kind of took he took himself to a different level, a different business model, and all of those kind of things. And so he kind of had to tear things back down to, where he was, to rebuild them with a different kind of identity for himself. Otherwise, he would have always forever been known as like the gym launch guy. And so
100%.
I think just recognizing that like there's always going to be a transition that takes place. And like, right now you might have a certain business or a certain book that you wrote that isn't serving you well. And it might just be a process of like re-envisioning and rebuilding things in a different way to, attract the right type of audience or the right type of customers for yourself overall. Because there's hundreds of bad business models and different types of businesses. And, I was in one, not that long ago. And it's, it takes one re-envision to, see traction for yourself. And your trajectory can be unlimitless, limitless at that stage, if you find the right path for yourself.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it is just keep reminding yourself of that perspective, trying to maintain that perspective and not just compare yourself to the person who you perceive to be this overnight success, but miss the fact that they have 10 years of evolving and unlearning things and trying new stuff and readjusting.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I think that's a great way to wrap the episode. Dan, thank you so much for coming on the show. Is there anywhere where you would like to send people after the episode?
Yeah, riggingthegame.com would get you to all my different businesses and socials and all that sort of stuff.
Awesome. riggingthegame.com. That will be linked down below in the description. And Dan, it's been a pleasure. Thanks again. Damn, what an awesome episode. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing on your podcast platform of choice so you get notified every single time a new episode releases. And if you're struggling with your book sales, head over to smartauthormedia.com/audit to get a free audit of your book sales to see where we can help you bridge the gap between not many sales to a lot of sales. It's a free resource call that we have together where I give you some clear action steps that you can take to take your stuff from broken to selling. I'll see you over there. Thanks again for listening.